Hello everyone, welcome once again to my kitchen. It is a Tuesday morning and today's topic is going to be temples in ancient Egypt. So I am Aset here at the Goddess Inside, the face behind all of the beautiful pictures that you see of the temples in ancient Egypt and modern day Egypt because they're still there. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about the temples, the reason why, is because every time that I go into the temple space, it doesn't matter if I've been there already 12 times, I always find something new and interesting to see on the wall and to decipher and to interpret. And there's walls that are filled with images and hieroglyphs and stories, like room after room after room. So it truly never gets old, and you could spend a whole lifetime studying one temple, which some people have done in the past. But one of the things that people don't realize about the temples perhaps is that they are a visual representation of kind of the as above so below concept of the temples being they have the floor that goes in, and they would have the ceiling. And as you go in to the temple, the closer you get to the inner sanctuary, the floor kind of goes up and the ceiling level goes down. And so you get kind of squished as you go back into the temple. And then visually also you go through these large hypostyle hall areas where the tops of the temple, or the tops of the pillars, are in the shape of lotus and papyrus stalks. So you've got this image of walking through the papyrus, and outside the temple there's generally a sacred lake. So all of this that we see as, oh yes, there's a lake that the priests use for purification. Oh yes, there's this sanctuary in the back of the temple. Oh yes, there are these columns that are topped differently with papyrus and lotus buds at the top. But all of this is a symbol of the Mound of Creation and the place of the birth of the gods. So when you go in to the temple, you go in, it's like you're walking through the marsh. As it gets closer into the center of the temple where the sanctuary is, it gets darker and darker, and the floor comes up and up. So then you're on this Mound of Creation. So that's part of what is going on in the temples. Many of the temples that we see today, even though they may have been built during the Ptolemaic period, such as Edfu Temple or Dendera, these are temples that are built on top of temples from the past. And there's actually a place inside of the temple of Hathor at Dendera where you can see on the floor, they've pulled some of the blocks away, and you can see the tops of pillars of a temple underneath Dendera Temple. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Another temple that is very easy to see this concept of what's happened of building on the temple on top of a temple over time is at Esna. So at Esna, when you go into the town and you reach the area where the temple is, you have to go down these, I don't want to say huge and massive, but there's a very long staircase that takes you down into this pit. And in the pit is where the temple is. So, over time, think about this. You've got the wind, you've got the weather from thousands and thousands of years and blowing around, and the sand is, kind of coming into the temples. And if you didn't keep it all out, eventually it would fill in. And that's what happened many times when the temples became out of use, over the years after the Greeks came in and the Romans came in and all the things changed. So the temples were not being utilized in the way that they were in the past. So they would fill up with sand. Some of the temples, such as at Esna and also at Dendera and at Edfu, when you look up at the ceiling, you'll see that the ceiling is black. And what this is from in antiquity, when people would actually live in the temple. So the temple was not being used anymore as a temple. The sand had come in and filled in much of the floor space up to the ceiling, maybe even 10 feet up to the ceiling, like having a ceiling of 10 feet with the top of the sand. And they would build their fires in there to stay warm. They would cook in there. They would live in there. And so you'll see some of the restoration that's being done inside these temples, where they're painstakingly, cleaning off this soot to reveal the beautiful colors and the images underneath all of that. And I remember the last time that I was at Dendera, I noticed one of the tops of the Hathor columns inside there was all blackened from the smoke that had come from the fires in the past. So it's really an interesting thing to look at if you want to go down a fun little rabbit hole, is to look at, vintage images of these temples from the early 1900s, late mid 1800s, and see the disrepair that they're in. All of the sand that's covering them, and then all of the work that's been done to them so that we can see them, that they're in the state that they're in today. Now, Edfu Temple is one of the temples that is one of the most, they call it a complete temple, because it's not fallen in. It's pretty much in the same shape and condition that it was in many, many years ago when it was built. So you'll see that it has an outer court, then there's an inner court, and then you enter into the body of the temple. And so there were these different areas of the temple that were accessible to the public or not. So out in the outer court areas, this is where we'll see on the pylons outside, the pharaoh generally in his position of overcoming the enemies, which, in these like battle looking scenes. And basically what that's telling the people is that the king is always doing everything that he can to overcome chaos. He is keeping the principle of Ma'at throughout the land of Egypt by the things that the king does also inside the temples, because the king was supposed to be like the high priest in the temples, and so he would do these different rituals in the temples. Now, of course, the king can't be everywhere, so the high priests and priestesses would embody, they would be, just as the pharaoh was the embodiment of the living Horus, sometimes the priests and priestesses were the embodiment of the king, enacting all of the rites, giving the offerings, and upholding Ma'at throughout all of the land. Then as you go inside the temple, then there were only the priests and priestesses would be allowed inside to do the rituals. Something else that we don't think oftentimes about when we think of the ancient temples is that they were centers of the community. So remember, you have the outer court area for the public to come and be a part of the festivals, because ancient Egyptians loved their festivals, and they would have feast days, and all of these offerings would be, it was a very exciting time, and there would be lots of eating and drinking and dancing and having a wonderful time together and celebrating. So when they came, I just lost my train of thought, so hold on just a second. I have so much running in my head that I want to tell you, and I'm like 5 sentences ahead in the topics. So when they're in the temple and they're celebrating, this is why sometimes I don't do live things, because I forget stuff that I'm trying to talk about. So let's just move on then to the next thing that I wanted to talk about. When we look at the temple walls, so remember I was talking about the different temple walls and the things that you could see and the different stories and things that are being depicted on there. One of the things that you'll see depicted inside the temple walls is the establishment. A lot of times you'll see this, the establishment of the temple. So this is again a thing that the pharaoh would come and do, where he would be attended by the gods, sometimes Ptah or Thoth or Seshet, and they would be there with their writing tablet and writing things down and making sure that everything was measured correctly. So Ptah and Seshet, they are like the god and goddess of architecture, and then Thoth, of course, he also is a god of numbers and order and making sure everything is written down properly. So we'll see the pharaoh there, we'll see him with the gods, and he'll be laying out, if you've ever built anything, sometimes you'll drive a stake in the ground and then you'll run a string from one stake to the next stake so you can establish the lines of the walls that you're building. So they would be setting the lines, they would be digging. You'll see him there. It's really fun to see. He has the plow that he's using to set, start digging the trenches for the foundation of the temple. And this plow that he uses is in the symbol of a hieroglyph that we can pronounce as Mer. And when we see this hieroglyphic symbol of the plow with the reed feather or the reed stick, then this is the word Mary, which means beloved. So isn't that a beautiful thing to see on the temple, is that this nurturing, it's the plow, the farmer, he nurtures the ground, he pays attention to it, and everything grows and flourishes from there. So we see on the temple wall, the pharaoh is using this plow, this symbol of the beloved, part of the word for the symbol of beloved, and he's using that to lovingly establish the boundaries of the temple. So we've talked today a little bit about what the temple represents. We've talked a little bit about the different areas in the temple. Oh, and I remember the thing I was going to tell you earlier. A lot of times we don't think about the things that would also be inside the temple area. They were the centers of the town. So there would also be an area, oftentimes you'll see this all in Abydos especially, there's the butcher's room. So this is where they would perform all of the things that they needed to do to prepare the animals for the offering, so that when we see these depictions on the walls of all the geese and like the leg of beef and these types of things like this, they have the room in there where they would take care of all of those things. They're also a place of school, of teaching, and it was a community center. So the offerings then that were left for the gods were given, they don't just sit there and rot all day. So once the gods had finished eating them, then the food was given to the priests and priestesses, because they're working in the temple. And then what they didn't use, then they were giving that out also to the people in the town. So the temple was a very vibrant, alive part of the community. And it also represented this Mound of Creation and this place of sanctuary for the gods. And when we talk about the things that are also on the walls, especially if the king is giving offerings to the gods or things like that, or presenting the statue of Ma'at to the gods, letting them know that he's kept peace in Upper and Lower Egypt, all of these things are like enlivened. And the purpose of them was so that if something happened and this wasn't actually physically taking place inside the temple, it's on the wall. And so it's still taking place magically inside the temple. And then I think there was one other thing that I wanted to talk about with the temples. We will see different kinds of temples throughout Egypt. You'll see temples that are built for the gods, or they're dedicated to a god or a goddess, such as Philae Temple, Hathor's Temple at Dendera, Edfu Temple, Kamombo Temple, to name just a few. And then we'll also see mortuary temples. So these are the temples like Medinet Habu. We see for Ramses III, we'll see Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, Dira Bahri, and also Seti I's temple at Abydos. Although there are 7 chapels in there to the gods, or 9, 7 or 9, forget. it's also a chapel for Seti as a god. So that's what the mortuary temples were. They were a celebration of the pharaoh as they have ascended and transformed in death into becoming an Osiris, into becoming one with the sun god. And so they are then deified at that point in their existence. I don't want to say in their life or their death, but in their existence, because this is part of their practice, was to not only to come and, give offerings to the gods and goddesses, but then after the king would die, then in his mortuary temple, there was a whole important ritual that would take place, and he or she would have their priests that would come in and take care of bringing offerings and feeding the ka of the king who is deceased. So lots of fun information about temples. If you have any questions, nobody has any questions so far that they've popped in that I've seen. Let me just double check here. No, not so far. But if you do have questions about the temples, please feel free to comment on this. And if you want to learn more, I'm happy to answer all of your questions. And thank you so much for joining me in my kitchen. I did go ahead today and make my coffee, so I'm going to go enjoy that now. And I hope that you, as always, enjoy everything about today.